If you're a facilities manager at a university, you know students rely on the cafeteria for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the occasional late-night snack. So when a dishwasher breaks down and dirty plates pile up, the mess hall can turn messy in the blink of an eye. Enter Grainger. With over 1 million industrial-grade products and fast delivery, the product you need now is never far away. So you can turn that dishwasher back into a lean, clean washing machine. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
The great thing about researching a book like Inventing Paradise is coming across these letters between all these guys. It's like reading diaries from middle school. It's very, and I put, some of the excerpts are in the book. It's very juicy, a lot of backstabbing. They're like the Kardashians, just like these old men, though.
Today's guest is Paul Haddad, and if you're a history nerd like me, or just love a little old school Hollywood drama, you are in for a treat. Paul's latest book, Inventing Paradise, is all about the creation of early Los Angeles, and trust me, it is a wild tale.
My greatest resource to this day is newspapers.com. If you're an aspiring writer or you want to do a nonfiction book that really delves into history, I can't recommend it enough.
In this episode, Paul gives us the lowdown on his multi-step research process for uncovering the details that bring his stories to life.
For this book, Inventing Paradise, it seemed like a natural connection to do it with Santa Monica Press because that publisher had published my other books that were about Los Angeles. So I naturally pitched them first, and they liked the idea. So it was nice to not have to shop around an idea for months.
Paul's published several books without the help of an agent, and he's got some great advice about finding a good home for your book all by yourself. So writers, you're going to want to take notes because Paul has got plenty of wisdom to share.
There's nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed.
Welcome to The Bleeders, a podcast and support group about book writing and publishing. I'm writer and podcaster Courtney Kosak, and each week I'll bring you new conversations with authors, agents, and publishers about how to write and sell books.
Hi, this is Paul Haddad. I'm the author of Inventing Paradise, the power brokers who created the dream of Los Angeles.
So I always start with this lightning round of 5 questions. So when did you first identify as a writer?
I identified very young, probably 6 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because I don't know what it was, but the thrill of just stapling together blank pages appealed to me just to write. I guess I would draw also, and then I focused more on stories and then creating these different books that were storybooks or maze books when I got older, like all these different mazes you can do, like fun books. And I would give them to my sister or my friends, and then I would do my own like world atlas and other kind of books. So I was probably created like 100 books until I was 15 years old.
That is so cute. Was that what you did immediately after you got out of school too? Were you like, okay, I'm going to be a writer?
Not really. I kind of at that point morphed into filmmaking and making documentaries, and I went to film school, and I didn't really have my first real published book until I was in my 40s, like 13 years ago.
Oh, I just turned 40, so I love to hear that.
Life begins at 40.
Yes, that's what they say. What's your all-time favorite book?
Ask the Dust by John Fonte.
Okay, tell us about this book and why it's your favorite.
It focuses on LA it's a fiction. It was made into a not so great movie with Colin Farrell and Salma Hayek. But the book itself is fantastic. It focuses on LA in the 1930s, during the Depression, much of it taking place. This one character, Bandini, who moved to LA from Colorado, is trying to find his place in the world and in Los Angeles. And it just captures the essence of Los Angeles at that time from the standpoint of living in Bunker Hill, which is where a lot of transplants would go to find work and cheap housing. And it was already kind of getting really dilapidated. And so he just goes a lot of dive bars and meets some very interesting people and prostitutes and drug lords. And he's struggling to be a writer and make a go of it. And it's just the prose and everything about the book, the imagery is just, it sticks with you. And it's a book I read from time to time over and over just for inspiration.
I love that. What's your dream writing routine?
It's funny, I live in Los Angeles. So one of the places that I like going on occasion is Catalina Island. The whole Channel
Uh-huh.
Islands off the coast of California are really nice. And Catalina is a place that Robert Towne apparently went to when he was writing Chinatown. He wrote much of the book
Oh,
there. And there have been other writers who've gone there to write. And I thought it'd be really cool to go there for like 6 months and rent like a little apartment and just have a routine that I can write during the day, head into the village of Avalon,
uh-huh.
for lunch or in the evening and just kind of hear the ocean and seagulls. It's still a very idyllic place. There's no cars allowed on the island. You could drive a golf cart, but it's just still very much of nature and a very inspirational place to write, I would think. It'd be really kind of neat.
Yeah, yeah. So what does your real writing routine look like?
Real writing routine is it's less predictable than that would be. I try to work in the mornings because that's when my brain is at its sharpest.
Uh-huh.
Usually after I've gone on a walk or worked out, I'm kind of a morning person. And in the afternoons, like after lunch, I'll kind of like do some more work, sometimes more organizational work, more editing, kind of
Uh-huh.
organizing and researching. But I typically work in the mornings and somewhat in the afternoon.
Are you like a binger where if you have a project, you'll just touch it every day and make sure you stay at it, or are you more sporadic?
I I tend to focus. I go down the rabbit hole. I have pretty good focus or hyper focus for better or worse. I
Uh-huh.
have to, because I have a family too, so I have to step out of myself
Uh-huh.
to be a dad, be a husband, and sometimes you just got to take the car in and you have to put aside whatever you're working on sometimes for a couple days or you're
Yeah.
promoting. Like right now I'm trying to research my next book, but a lot of what I'm doing now is focused on my current book and trying to get it out in the world, make
Uh-huh.
people aware of it, and that's all good. So I don't mind bouncing around between projects.
Yeah, I do find that energy switch hard though. Like when I'm going from podcasting to writing, it's like totally different. So I
Yeah,
imagine that right now you're in a little bit of a
yeah. It's good because the book I just wrote is very fresh in my mind still. So it's good to
Uh-huh.
do a lot of author events now because all the facts are kind of still in there.
Right.
What I find is sometimes previous books, like the book before this was called Freewaytopia, How Freeways Shape Los Angeles. And I could really nerd out on that and hit people with a lot of stats and numbers and figures and people, how freeways affected the growth of LA. But I have to have that information very top of mind. And
Right.
because that book was published a few years ago, I have to get caught up again on it. And that sometimes takes a lot of work, versus the most latest book.
Totally. What's one piece of writing that makes you jealous you didn't write it?
So I think, as I mentioned earlier, I got into filmmaking and
Uh-huh.
and producing documentaries out of college, and I really wanted to direct features. In fact, I directed a very low budget feature, kind of in the vein of a Woody Allen movie, because to me, the ideal screenplay and movie growing up was Annie Hall by Woody
Uh-huh.
Allen.
So Annie Hall, that's your
Yeah, because yeah, that would be my ideal, the one I would be envious of because he broke the fourth wall a lot, where he's
uh-huh.
speaking directly to the audience. Often that doesn't work, but it works in that movie because he breaks a lot of norms in that movie. It sometimes goes to animation. There's flashbacks. There's
Uh-huh.
subtitles, what people are thinking in their heads as they're speaking. There's it's addressing the viewer. There's a great scene early in the movie where Marshall McLuhan is pulled over into a lobby when someone's just spouting off about Marshall McLuhan movies, and Woody's character gets so upset he actually pulls Marshall McLuhan into the camera to say this guy's full of it. It took chances, and it's
Uh-huh.
funny and it's well acted and it's poignant. It has a great romance in it. It has everything, all in like 95 minutes, which is how long they should be today. But no one can seem to make a movie under 2 hours and 10 minutes anymore. So it's also an efficient movie, and I think it hits on a lot of levels for me as like the perfect movie and screenplay.
Okay, so let's talk Inventing Paradise. This was so interesting to me as a Angelino now of 20 years ish. So give us a short description of the book.
Well, the book focuses on the growth of Los Angeles through the prism of six men. And they are men because this is a very patriarchal time that I write about. And it's the era really post Civil War up until 1932, which is when LA pretty much stopped expanding and hosted the Summer Olympics. And so by that point, the narrative kind of comes to a neat conclusion because LA had kind of arrived on the global scene at that point. And so these individuals are Phineas Banning, who's known as the father of Los Angeles Harbor because he helped create the port of Los Angeles, which was very important to LA's growth. And then the other five all kind of lived during the same era, they all were living in Los Angeles from the 1890s up until the 1920s when they started dying, really. All lived very long lives for that time to about 80 years old. And those other five are Harrison Gray Otis, who ran the Los Angeles Times, his son-in-law, Harry Chandler, who also ran the Times, but also was a very wealthy landowner who was probably one of the wealthiest people in the United States. And then also Moses Sherman, who was a streetcar owner. He had a big streetcar line and also owned land, especially with Chandler. Henry Huntington, who also had a streetcar empire, and William Mulholland. He's the sixth person, who, of course, was the water chief who built the Los Angeles Aqueduct.
So, okay, how did you get the idea to write about this? And how did you land on these six guys in particular?
Yeah, the idea of telling the story of LA by intercutting between these individuals isn't necessarily unique. It's a formula that's been done with various books. But I felt that these six people were the essential, to me, they were the people who had lived in Los Angeles pretty much during the height of their power. And they were overseeing industries that helped LA grow, real estate, tourism, power of information to help affect policy, transportation, water. These were big things that helped spur Los Angeles' growth. So I looked at the sectors and the breadth of power that each of these people had, and they kind of rose above everybody else. There were certainly other very influential people, including Edward Doheny, who kind of started the oil industry, but he moved out of LA for 15 years. He wasn't really living in the city at the height of his powers. He would kind of go back and forth, and it was just that one sector of oil. And also these five people who were all living around the same time, they would invest in projects together. So there was a lot of communication between all of them. And they were friends, and sometimes they were enemies and frenemies. So they were involved in each other's lives. So it made for a natural narrative where I could cross-cut between all of them throughout the book.
Yeah. And is LA just a particular obsession of yours? Or I guess your last book, you were kind of talking about it too. So is that how you landed on the idea?
Yeah, I think, Freewaytopia, there had never been a book about freeways and how they shaped the landscape for good and bad in Los Angeles. And so when I was researching that, I did keep going back in time to see what led to the evolution of freeways, and often landed on these five really individuals, these moguls who helped shape the landscape and also who were responsible for the borders of Los Angeles as we know them today. They actually had influence on the growth of annexing the San Fernando Valley, for example, which was 100 square miles that was annexed in 1913, largely because Harry Chandler and Moses Sherman had bought up much of the land. And then Chandler was very much a car proponent, and he wanted to create highways, and eventually he backed freeways to build those out for the freeways out to the valley. And then freeways also kind of replicated the rail lines built by Moses Sherman and Henry Huntington. And so if you follow the pattern of growth in Los Angeles that was laid down by these individuals, those patterns often led to where freeways were built. So researching the freeway book brought me to these oligarchs, and that really gave me the foundation for the new book, Inventing Paradise.
That's amazing. I like when that happens, where it just delivers you to your next project.
Yeah, in a very organic way.
Yeah. So you say Los Angeles is a city that should not exist. So why was the deck stacked against LA?
Well, people like to say LA is a desert, and that's a cliche, but it's not really true. Anyone who's been to Palm Springs knows that's a desert, or
Right.
Death Valley. But Los Angeles is a Mediterranean climate. It's a semi-arid climate, so it's kind of a semi-desert, but has a lot of chaparral and a lot of greenery. But it is the kind of place that will have years of drought, as everybody knows. And so that when you have this temperamental water supply, that doesn't really lend itself to fast growth. And it actually limits growth. And so Los Angeles was for centuries, the people who lived here, whether they were indigenous or Spanish or Mexican, they relied on the Los Angeles River. And some years it could be a trickle, and other times of the year, it can be a torrent of water. So that in itself limited the ceiling for growth to about 200,000 people. Anything more than that, it wouldn't really be tenable. And so that's the main reason why Los Angeles was really limited in terms of the natural resources around here.
And then so you focus on this basically 50-year period from the late 1870s to the early 1930s.
Correct.
So obviously there's over 400 pages that people should read to learn about the full story, but what's kind of like the Cliff's Notes of what happened that allowed that explosion to happen?
What happened was water was the driving force to make Los Angeles as big as it currently is. And it is 468 square miles. But in the 1890s, it was only 29 square miles. So what happened in that 30 to 40 year span where it just grew exponentially? And what happened was a lot of these little towns, Hollywood was once its own town, Venice Beach was once its own town, many of these small little cities and sometimes unincorporated areas, most often unincorporated areas. And what happened was a lot of unincorporated areas needed water, and the only way they could get water was through their own wells, these little like artesian wells. But once those went dry, then they needed to access a bigger water source. And where you really saw annexations, cities annexing with Los Angeles take off was after the LA Aqueduct opened. And that happened in 1913. And that's when William Mulholland built a 233-mile aqueduct that accessed a river in Northern California known as the Owens River. And that allowed for up to 2 million people to live in the LA area. And these smaller communities, when they were running out of water, if they wanted to access the aqueduct, they first had to merge with Los Angeles. That was written into the city charter. And so just from that fact alone, LA was able to access hundreds of square miles as they acquired these cities that asked to be let in so they could access water. That was the main reason.
So the annexation, it's so interesting to me how all the different places came to be subsumed by Los Angeles. So what was maybe your most surprising annexation or kind of like your favorite story of that?
Oh gosh, there's so many. So Los Angeles had a lot of power in the early 1900s, 1910s, and it could kind of hold these cities hostage and really bully them into joining Los Angeles. So there were a lot of special elections called so that a little community like Sawtell, and there it's on the west side, kind of near Westwood, Sawtell wanted to join like in 1918 and have their own election because they wanted to access LA's water. And it was a very close election. And LA absorbed Sawtell, but a lot of people who lived there felt that the election was rigged. Sound familiar? and so some of the city council members said, no, we're still our own city. We're not going to join LA. And Los Angeles just went into their city hall, grabbed their safe, locked the doors, and basically took over the city hall of Sawtell and held the city hostage until they kind of cried uncle, really. So this was a government in exile, Sawtell, and they would have to conduct business in each other's homes. And the people who lived there didn't know who was really running the city. Was it Sawtell or was it Los Angeles? And this went on for a couple years until the Supreme Court got involved in California. And eventually Sawtell did join Los Angeles. But LA would throw its weight around. And another city called Barnes City, that's probably my favorite story. A very, very small town. It was located near today's Culver City, and it was essentially a circus town because there was a circus called the Barnes Circus. Al Barnes ran it, like Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus.
Uh-huh.
Those were all really big in the 20s. And he essentially wanted to create a tax shelter. So he created Barnes City, and people who lived there who were not employees of his circus all felt that it was not a real city. In fact, when he had an election to determine whether they could incorporate, people claimed that some of his monkeys voted in their cages. And then also like circus members who weren't even citizens of Barnes City. They were transients really who traveled the country with him. He'd have them vote, but they weren't really citizens. Anyway, long story short, that eventually got absorbed by Los Angeles, Barnes City. It lasted maybe 8 months. And Los Angeles did annex much larger areas. Sometimes, like I mentioned, the Valley didn't really have any people. That was 100 square miles.
Mm-hmm.
There was another section near Sawtelle, which is a lot of where Mulholland Drive is now, and Topanga Canyon. That was 13 square miles. You had these big parcels of land. Providencia was another near the Hollywood sign. And that was annexed in the 20s. And many of these didn't have a lot of people, but LA kept growing because it wanted to annex these areas before a neighboring town did, a neighboring independent town. Like Providencia was very close to Burbank, and Burbank is still an independent city. And Los Angeles was worried that Burbank was going to annex this big section near, again, the Hollywood sign. So a lot of the areas that LA annexed were to kind of, it was like a game of chess. It was a preemptive annexation so that another city could not consolidate that area. And that often drove a lot of annexations as well.
It's super interesting because, if you live in LA, there are some holdouts, though, like Santa Monica is its own city, Pasadena. I was aware of the holdouts, but it was so interesting to learn about how everyone else got sucked in.
And really the shining knight on trotting in on a white horse in all of this was the Metropolitan Water District. That saved cities like Burbank, Pasadena, Beverly Hills, Santa Monica from having to be consumed by Los Angeles or join Los Angeles, because that's an agency that still exists to this day. And it was created in the late 20s. And it essentially established this idea that any city that wanted water from the Owens Valley or later the Colorado River, because there was an aqueduct that was built from the Colorado River to Los Angeles in the 30s, they could pay their pro rata share in this agency, the MWD. And that actually allowed these cities to survive on their own, because now they didn't have to go to Los Angeles for water. They could just pay the MWD. By 1932, that's one reason that the annexations kind of stopped. For one thing, there wasn't much land to keep expanding LA, but they also really couldn't gobble up any other neighboring towns because they would just join the MWD for their water, and that was that.
It was crazy to me, though, that at one point people in Inland Empire and beyond were even scared of getting annexed. It's like, that's such a huge city.
That was probably the most surprising thing to me, was this hubris, this idea that Los Angeles should be the size of like 7 Rhode Islands.
Yeah.
Like 12,000 square miles. And to achieve that, it would have to absorb much of, as you said, the Inland Empire, Orange County, parts of north of Los Angeles up to Mojave County. And the thinking behind that was, for one thing, Los Angeles had a lot of bills to pay. By 1930, it had 1.3 million people, and it kept annexing these different districts to help pay its water bond bills. And it almost became a self-fulfilling prophecy that it had so many bills to pay, and that you needed other districts to access their tax rolls to get more money in your coffers. I equate it to like a rat with growing teeth that just needs to keep eating. And so Los Angeles was looking to service the bonds that it paid for all these waterworks and all of its infrastructure. And you do that by having other citizens join the city. Los Angeles leaders took kind of a cue from San Francisco, which was an eternal rival, still is, of LA. But San Francisco is its own city and county. So there's San Francisco City and County, and they're one and the same. And Los Angeles thought, well, if they can do it, we can do it. And when you consolidate LA County and city together, if you synthesize them, you'll have a lot of power. But the difference is San Francisco city and county is only 46 square miles.
Oh.
And LA County is, oh my God, much bigger. I don't know the exact number again, but it's the city itself is 468 square miles. So that gives you some idea of what you're talking about. It would be impossible to govern that as a city, something that size.
So let's talk about San Francisco for a second, because it seemed like San Francisco was ahead in the race at the beginning of the book. So how did LA sort of win the race to become California's preeminent city? And yeah, how did that competition play out?
Yeah, San Francisco had well over 100,000 people right around the time of the gold rush, and LA had 5,000. LA was a little peon. No one gave it much thought. And Los Angeles had its first real wave of immigrants, even internal migration from America, people coming here in the 1880s. That was the first era that LA really saw a lot of growth, because the word was out that the climate was great here. People were coming to go to sanitariums to get healthy from tuberculosis and other respiratory illnesses. San Francisco doesn't have that. It's very foggy and cold there. So the idea that LA is kind of a paradise, that emerged in the 1880s. And certainly you had Harrison Otis and Harry Chandler at the LA Times really promoting the idea that Los Angeles is a place to come, not just to get healthy, but to stay healthy, and including a healthy business environment. And then the produce industry really helped. A lot of produce, oranges, lemons, grapefruits, they were being shipped across the US, and people knew all the produce came from Southern California. And then you had the oil industry, and soon the car industry, Hollywood. And many of these industries were cultivated by Harry Chandler in particular. When he was at the Los Angeles Times, he would send a midwinter edition of the Times to people on the East Coast and in the Midwest as they were freezing through these frigid winters. They would get a Los Angeles Times in their mailbox with like a glossy cover showing people frolicking on the beach and sunshine behind them, and they're plucking an avocado from a tree. And it looked like the ideal place with cheap land. So that drew a lot of people, was all the promotion that Harry Chandler had with his LA Times. And also, I think you're asking, how did LA become superior to San Francisco? One thing that helped LA was the 1906 earthquake that destroyed much of San Francisco.
Oh, yeah.
LA had not had a big earthquake by 1906. And in fact, whether they believed it or not, it didn't really matter. But all the founding fathers of the city felt that LA was immune from large earthquakes, and that all the people in San Francisco should come live down in Los Angeles, where the big one would never happen. In fact, they were kind of dancing on San Francisco's grave, saying, "Oh, one part of California could fall in the ocean, and the rest of the southern part wouldn't even notice," and which is really cold-hearted. And then, because this was kind of the tail end of the Gilded Era, when it was all about conquering nature and manufacturing industry, many of these visionaries, they thought it was a point of pride that Los Angeles had a manufactured harbor. Los Angeles Harbor was mostly created out of just dredging the water to make it more navigable. And when it opened in 1900, the city boosters started saying it was superior to San Francisco's bay, which is a beautiful natural bay. But it is a natural bay. It was a God-created bay, and LA's was man-made, and therefore it was custom-made, and it was better because it wasn't reliant on the limitations of nature. And so it was kind of poo-pooing the natural beauty of San Francisco, even when it came to their harbors. And it just continued up to the 19-teens. Harry Chandler got wind that there was a film crew that came out from New York, the Christie brothers, because most movies were shot in New York, around the early 1900s. But they wanted to escape, the Christie brothers wanted to escape the patent wars of Thomas Edison, who would come down at people who used movie cameras that he helped design. And so these guys and a lot of people went to the West Coast and settled in San Francisco to shoot. Well, it started raining in San Francisco.
Oh.
Chandler got wind of the Christie brothers being in San Francisco, stuck outside, which is where he shot most movies because he needed sunlight, even for like interior scenes. There were no ceilings on the sets. And he commissioned a train and alerted the Christie brothers it was sunny and clear skies in LA and come on down. And he paid for the Christie brothers' entire entourage to come down to LA. They finished their movie in Los Angeles in like 1914. They loved it so much, they established roots in Hollywood. Others came after them and realized this was the place to be. And Chandler helped push the Hollywood industry as well. And that was another knock against San Francisco. The weather was just too unpredictable. And then finally, Los Angeles was a place free of unions. San Francisco was a union town. So if you wanted to grow really fast, I compared all these moguls to the latter day, like today's Silicon Valley tech bros, where it's all about move fast and break things, ask questions later. And that's how they operated. They didn't want any unions. It was kind of the Wild West. Labor costs were cheaper. It was 30% cheaper to conduct business in Los Angeles versus San Francisco. So that was very appealing to businessmen. And, workers went for it as well, because many of these jobs for Huntington or whoever else, Chandler, they were pretty good paying and they treated their employees pretty well. But they just didn't want you to be unionized, and they would have union spies and they would make sure you were fired if you tried to unionize. But it certainly was good for businessmen and business.
So which of these visionaries or tycoons or whatever, which do you feel like was, if you had to pick one, had the biggest impact on Los Angeles?
Without a doubt, Harry Chandler. Most people are surprised if I say that because he's not as well known as William Mulholland or even Henry Huntington. Many people know that Huntington was the streetcar guy. Even Roger Rabbit refers to the whole red car system that Huntington helped build, the movie Roger Rabbit. Or people know the Huntington Gardens and Library in Los Angeles or like San Marino. Great place. Mulholland Drive, the movie. Mulholland built the aqueducts. People know Mulholland. Chinatown is obviously influenced a lot by Mulholland's legacy. But Chinatown's also influenced by Harry Chandler's legacy. And the screenwriter, Robert Towne, said he actually had Chandler in mind when he was creating Noah Cross, the kingpin of that movie, played by John Huston. But Chandler is someone who was very behind the scenes. So the character in the movie is different than how Chandler was in real life. Chandler was a puppet master who would work, behind the scenes, building consensus and installing people in city council who do his bidding. Moses Sherman was famously a very good friend of his for decades. And he would install Moses Sherman on the water board to make sure the water bond passed. And then he made sure that police chiefs and city planners were all on the same page with Chandler's vision of expanding LA so that Chandler could get richer and so that everyone else could thrive and that the city could grow, unfettered growth. Chandler he got a lot of his millionaire buddies to put money in to create things like the Auto Club, which we take for granted now. The Southern California Auto Club was co-founded by Harry Chandler because he pushed cars. And LA had more cars than any city on earth in the 1920s, largely because of Chandler. And that was creating a good roadway system, tearing up streetcars at some point, and also tapping into the oil industry in Los Angeles. And cars could take you to areas that streetcars couldn't, like up into these hillside neighborhoods that would become Beverly Hills or Hollywood or Bel Air. You needed cars for that as well. And then he lured car manufacturers here, Ford, GM, tire companies like Goodyear. So he had this master plan, again, always behind the scenes, not wanting his name on anything. These guys all had giant egos. Sherman's name is still around on Sherman Way and that street in the valley. Sherman Oaks is named after him. Huntington's name is everywhere in LA, but Chandler is really only recognizable from Chandler Boulevard in the valley. And even then, he didn't want his name there, but he kind of gave in. He would rather be away from the limelight because it brought less scrutiny, and also because he didn't want his actions to seem self-serving as the publisher of the LA Times. So it was important for him to act like everyone was behind this when really he was the guy pulling a lot of strings.
So let's talk about Chandler's dark side a little bit. You talk about how he pushed eugenics.
Yeah. Chandler was like a lot of these guys, they were Republicans, they were very conservative in real life. And, Chandler had a love-hate relationship with Hollywood. He realized that he needed the Hollywood industry here to really thrive, but he had a disdain for a lot of their hedonism. He was a man who liked to live life biblically and have milk and honey for breakfast, for example. And he was very much a man of family values. I mean, he could be pretty ruthless as a businessman, but he also, where the dark side comes into play is when Los Angeles was established, he wanted to make sure that whoever entered the portals of paradise were white people, often from Northern Europe. The 20s was a time that you had a lot of non-WASPy people coming to LA looking for work. The city was expanding. So Chandler in particular wanted to push areas that were whites only, a lot of the neighborhoods that he helped develop. And that was across the US, of course. I mean, redlining was a big thing in the 1930s, but it started kind of in the 20s in LA. And then by the 30s, when Hitler was coming to power in Germany, I think by 1933, the LA Times started publishing a column by this eugenist named Fred Hoag. And he had a weekly column that would essentially tell people that there's this great thing going on in Germany.
Oh my
where,
God.
Hitler has established this program where if there's pure bloodstream, meaning, the Aryan race, such people were encouraged to have families, and those who were not of pure bloodstream were being sterilized, or it was suggested that they not have kids. And Chandler bought into that. And a lot of people at the time, they thought it was this science that could just make for a better breed of people and help humanity. And he joined the Human Betterment Society, which actually had a platform that we should sterilize morons or imbeciles or people of color or low income or aren't contributing to society and are dragging it down, including, dipping into your pocketbook, especially when FDR became president. They didn't want that progressive agenda that he was pushing. So really, that was something that is a black mark on Chandler's legacy, to the point that there were some buildings at Caltech, the famous, science college out here in Southern California. He helped get Caltech going, Chandler did, and his name was on some buildings there that were stripped. His name was stripped from those buildings in 2019 because the board of trustees said, look, this was a debunked science even when he was alive. And that knowing eugenics is attached to him, they didn't want anything to do with it. But he had a lot of loopy ideas. I mean, he lured a guy to Los Angeles who was known as the Goat Doctor, and his name was John Brinkley. And if you had sexual dysfunction and you were a man, this doctor had this procedure that he swore by, where he would implant goat hormones into your testicles.
Oh my God.
So Chandler thought there was something to this, flew the guy out to Los Angeles, set him up with his own shingle. The guy claimed he made millions of dollars just from Chandler's endorsement alone. And he would work on people in the LA area many of whom had weird sicknesses after these transplants happened, where he's literally like taking, severed goat testicles and shoving them into men, grafting them into their scrotums. There's a great book on this called Charlatan, if you want to read more about Dr. John Brinkley. And anyway, so yeah, Chandler was a bit of a whack job himself.
So race comes up quite a bit in this book. Were you surprised by the role of racism really in shaping LA?
Not surprised, because I was familiar with it already. I think the one area that did surprise me was, I alluded earlier to the whole redlining of neighborhoods, which were areas that Black people or people of color, Latino, could not really build, because that was actually related to the federal government not giving loans to non-Caucasian homebuyers. That was the whole redlining idea that started in the 30s. But in the 20s, independent of the federal government, I was surprised to come across these maps when I was doing my research called white spot maps. And they were put out by the Chamber of Commerce and by business associations. And they were instructing people, businessmen, where to build industries and where people should live that were considered economic white spots. And it was always couched as an economic white spot when you looked at these maps. But coincidentally, they were areas in the hills and in largely white populated areas. So you didn't need any dog whistles to realize that they were trying to push white businessmen into the white areas. And at really like around that same time, maybe by the mid 20s, the white spots morphed into these subdivisions that said on the advertisements, which anyone could find in old newspaper ads, Silver Lake Terrace, whites only for your protection. Even Hollywoodland, when it was built, where the Hollywood sign is, that was whites only. So the white spot map started just entering the vernacular as people were emboldened, because at that point you can just come out and say this is an area for white people only, and that's for your protection as a homeowner so values don't go down, and for your safety. And they were partially emboldened because the KKK was a pretty influential force in American politics by the mid-20s. And in fact, there were 6 million members of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States at that time. So they could be more overt in their racism, to the point where LA even elected a mayor who was a member of the KKK in the late 20s, John Clinton Porter. Yeah, so that part all kind of surprised me.
Give us one common myth about Los Angeles that you were able to debunk with this book.
There are some good ones. The one that I keep coming back to is the fact that people vilify William Mulholland as the person who was responsible for ruining the lives of people in Owens Valley. William Mulholland was just an engineer who built the Los Angeles Aqueduct. It wasn't even his vision to build the aqueduct. It was someone named Fred Eaton, who was a former mayor who became a friend of Mulholland's, who was also a water engineer himself. So he was really kind of the bad guy who gets lost to history. Now, Mulholland, of course, he was deceitful, and he had expressed some lies in public. He knew what the real agenda was, that much of the water from Northern California was taken illegally, that it was under the guise of people like Fred Eaton going up there as ranch farmers who were interested in buying ranch land when really they wanted the land to get the water up there. So Mulholland was in on the ruse, but it wasn't his idea. So he's often vilified today as the person who ruined the lives of the people up there, because he was the one who executed the infrastructure. And no doubt he had a huge presence up there. People wanted to kill him. And he did say some nasty things about the farmers in Owens Valley. He said, "I'm sorry I ripped down so many trees to build the aqueduct, because now there's fewer branches to hang the SOBs from."
Yeah, I remember that part.
Yeah, he was pretty salty. So that's like a myth that, is out there still, that Mulholland was the devil. He was just doing what he was ordered. He had a savior complex. He wanted to be the guy who solved all the water problems for LA. Often it was other people's ideas, like the aqueduct, but he did decide how the waterworks should be built and all that. But that was mostly in the LA area when he was devising that whole system. There's another part to the Los Angeles story that I found enlightening, because Venice Beach is a very popular recreational area of LA. People love it. They attribute it to its founder, Abbot Kinney. He had this vision of creating a Venice by the beach that was just like Venice, Italy. It had miles of canals, roller coasters, piers. It was really an amazing place. Many of the canals have all been covered up. In fact, all of them have been covered up from the time that Abbot Kinney created this network of canals in the 20s. They've been paved over with streets. But there are still some canals that exist, and most people attribute them to Abbot Kinney. They weren't canals that he built, though. That's because 2 years before his vision of creating Venice Beach, there was another Venice in LA that was created by Moses Sherman. And the existing canals today were the ones that Moses Sherman built.
Oh.
So the real story is that Abbot Kinney copied the idea from Moses Sherman. Moses created a smaller Venice Beach that was more for rich people. He called it a millionaire's colony. He built these really nice canals, and there's still very nice mansions along them. And it wasn't until 2 or 3 years later that Abbot Kinney came up with a bigger Venice that clearly was influenced by Sherman's Venice that was just south of that. And that's the Venice we all have come to know, and that everyone attributes to the idea that was created by Abbot Kinney. And certainly he had the idea to do it. It's just the idea was already first executed by Moses Sherman.
That's so original. So you obviously did so much research for this enormous book. How did you tackle your research process? And any like takeaways for other writers interested in incorporating research in their work?
Sure. My greatest resource to this day is newspapers.com. If you're an aspiring writer or you want to do a nonfiction book that really delves into history, I can't recommend it enough. It's $70 every 6 months, so the subscription is pretty cheap. You can often get it through your local library even. It may not have the reach of a paid subscription, so I just paid for it so I could access all newspapers and not have access to others. I start with that because much of my research of old LA is derived from old newspapers. So there were a lot of newspapers at the turn of the century. There was not just the LA Times. There was the Los Angeles Herald, the Los Angeles Examiner, the Los Angeles Register. There were newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst, who was a rival of Harry Chandler's. So there were a lot of resources just from that alone. And I started with that because that really helped me actually when I was trying to talk about all the different regions that were annexed by Los Angeles. And there were like 78 of them, 78 unincorporated areas, 10 cities. So all 88 districts that were annexed by LA during this like 30, 40-year period, I could find articles on them because there are often elections to annex them that people would vote on. And then when they were accepted into the city, I could read, when that happened, the exact date, how big they were, what the voting tallies were. So newspapers were my first go-to when it came to like deep dive research. And then I peppered that in with visits to some of the research institutions in LA, the Huntington Library, the Sherman Library, which has many of the papers of Moses Sherman. That's down in Corona del Mar, like Newport Beach area. And much of Mulholland's ephemera and all of his old, missives and notes, letters, etc., are at Cal State Northridge. And there's a very good William Mulholland library there that was largely started by his granddaughter, Catherine Mulholland. So I visited those places a lot. And then I interviewed some academic people toward the end to really put things in perspective. And that's kind of like if you're building a pyramid, I started with the newspapers and then worked my way to these institutes so I could actually access old letters and things like that and ledgers. And then eventually interviewing people who can also give me a proper framework to explain the residual effects of a lot of the policies that were laid down by this oligarchy and how they affect Los Angeles today. I thought that was important to describe how LA's past informed the present. And the past has never really passed, as they say.
Right.
And it's important to talk to people far smarter than myself about what those ripple effects are.
Yeah, give us a little taste of those present day implications.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about like white spots in these areas that whites went to build homes and start businesses. And then when freeways were built, again, the freeways were built because of this framework laid down by Henry Huntington, Moses Sherman, Harry Chandler. Freeways, especially after World War II, allowed a lot of these white families who were living near the city center to go out to the suburbs built by a lot of these moguls. So that came to be known as white flight in the 50s, when whites left central business districts, central areas across America, and drove their Buicks and Cadillacs out to the suburbs and started their families with 2.5 kids and white picket fences, allowing them to build generational wealth in these, to this day, wealthier areas. Whereas the people living close to the city center were people of color moved into those previously white areas, especially when a lot of the restrictive covenants, racial covenants, were knocked down by courts in the 60s. And that allowed anyone to buy homes. And so the distressed areas today in Los Angeles, there's about 87% of these areas that are underserved, lower average house median income. 87% of them are people of color who, they were kind of languishing when everybody else who was white moved out to the suburbs or outlying areas in Los Angeles where they were building generational wealth. So that is the most immediate and obvious example of how the growth of Los Angeles was inequitable to people of color, also saddling them with environmental issues because they're often near freeways now, or these are park poor areas. They're just areas that don't get as much money or attention from City Hall or from the state. And that is being hopefully rectified now. The Biden administration has put money toward improving areas that were left behind. And it is certainly on everybody's mind now of how you can help rectify that. There's even a whole department called the LA Civil Rights Department that was created in 2020 to address these issues.
So I was going to ask you what most disappointed you about the city's history. Was this part of it?
Disappointed in the sense that I feel almost ashamed to be an Angelino, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, gosh, I mean, I understand why freeways were built. There wasn't really a conspiracy, as is so often. I guess that's another thing I've debunked, but that's been debunked before. There wasn't a conspiracy to rip up streetcars to create freeways. It was kind of a natural evolution of people going to these areas that streetcars couldn't go to. That was a big part of it. And then buses took over. Buses could get you to these areas, and they could travel on any streets. You know, streetcars were limited just to those tracks on certain streets. So streetcars limited growth, and streetcars were private enterprises too. They weren't even public transit. So that was a problem. So their days were always numbered. But it does disappoint me that there wasn't something to replace them at the point when they decided that, okay, maybe streetcars aren't such a good idea, but we could do subways. And subways were they would have been a lot cheaper to build when they were deciding to get rid of streetcars. And there were many opportunities to build subways. Even monorails were thrown around at one point. And that would have helped tremendously the environment. It would have made for a more equitable city. We'd have fewer cars on the road. And it wasn't really until the 90s that the Metropolitan Transit Association, the MTA, decided to build subways and light rail at a cost that was exponentially more expensive and continues to be really expensive. So, Los Angeles could have gotten a jump start on that, I think, with more forward-thinking people at the time. But it was really all about freeways and cars in the 50s and 60s. I mean, Caltrans had massive influence on Los Angeles. And, you got to blame the federal government, too. Because during the Eisenhower administration in the 50s, it was all about building interstates. 41,000 miles of interstates were laid down in the 50s and 60s. And the federal government incentivized Caltrans to build freeways because if you built an interstate, like Interstate 10, the 5, the 405, 90% of the construction costs were paid for by the federal government. Oh. So it was just simple math. What are you going to build, a freeway or an expensive subway that the federal government's not subsidizing? And so the government was pushing car culture. So there were a lot of reasons why LA was left behind when it came to subways. And it would have been nice. That's the part that disappoints me, that wasn't a system that was laid down 40 years before they started really building subways and light rail.
What made you most proud to be an Angelino?
What makes me most proud is, it sounds cliched to say that LA is a paradise. That's what it was built as, to lure people out here, but kind of still is.
Yeah.
I do a lot of travel. I used to do more for my work. And I'd always come back to Los Angeles with a new appreciation after coming from another country, just because the climate is so great here. I argue in the book that LA was always destined to be. It's almost immaterial whether it really is a paradise or not, because people are drawn to the idea of paradise and the promised land. And LA comes pretty darn close to delivering on that.
Yeah.
It does have smog, but nothing like when I was a kid. You couldn't even see the mountains most days. Now you can, with double the amount of people living here also, since I was, in the 70s. But it also has beaches, mountains. It's got all that topography that people associate with Southern California, where you can go surfing in the morning and go snow skiing in the afternoon if it's winter time in the local mountains. And so it delivers on a lot of levels from a nature lover standpoint, but also culture and restaurants. It's all here. I mean, if you've got people gravitating to the city who are really creative thinkers, who are also consuming other creative thinkers' endeavors. And so it feeds on one another. And so every day you could be inspired by something. And I just love that it also just is a place that people come to reinvent themselves. And that's just, I think, built into human nature. You always need a place like that. And it's just inspirational too. I think many of these men I talk about in my book, they took big swings and they got stuff done. They built the observatory, Hollywood Bowl, many of these great venues. The Coliseum, Chandler really is the one who got that built, and it's going to host its third Olympics in 2028, that's never happened in the history of the world, where the same venue has hosted events, track and field and whatnot, opening and closing ceremonies over 3 different Olympics. And so I like that their vision it's withstood the test of time, that it's still inspirational, and they really were onto something.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of LA myself. So, okay, tell us about your writing process with this book. And I know you've written other books too, so I'm curious if it's evolved over time and about how long it takes you to put a book like this together.
A book like Inventing Paradise, this was the longest book I've worked on in terms of researching it. So I probably spent a good year researching. And for myself, I want to make sure I do thorough research so that the writing part will be fun because I'm informed by facts. And so I will kind of vomit a lot of information into a document that might be 800 pages long. But really what it is just a cutting and pasting into this document of newspaper articles, things I found online, emails from people I've reached out to, anything that I discover that I can cut and paste and throw onto a document, I will do that. And so as my research grows, and as I go to these institutions, even like the Huntington, I'll take pictures with my phone of, let's say it's an old magazine, the Saturday Evening Post of 1938, which had a good profile on Harry Chandler that I didn't find anywhere else. A lot of good, personal, juicy information about him. And I would take pictures of those pages, and then Google Photos now will recognize text. And so I'll have it highlight the text, and then I could take that text on my photo and I'll spit that in the document and I'll paste it right into that same master document of research. And sometimes the text is a little off and I have to make a correction, or it's like, what is it? It's a little gibberishy, but you have to make sure it's like really clean when you shoot it with your camera. And then I can keyword Chandler, and then it'll like highlight, 268 different areas in my document. And then I can do the same for Mulholland and Otis and these other characters. And so I know where to go to find information on them. And then it's a matter of sculpting, like, well, what's the story I'm going to tell with this book? And for Inventing Paradise, I knew I wanted to tell it mostly chronologically. So the chapters are laid out in a very chronological manner. So I would then look at the dates that I was working with and kind of start parsing them out in these different sections. 1900 to 1902, 1910 to 1912. I'm kind of simplifying a little bit, but that gave me some structure so that when I started the writing process, I kind of knew where the narrative was going to go. So that was a good year of doing what I just described. The writing to me always goes much quicker than the actual research itself. And I would say the bulk of it was written in 6 months, probably.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. I'm very in the zone and prolific when I write. That's the one time I am ultra focused. It's not just writing in the morning, it's writing in the afternoon, it's writing at night. I'm also cleaning up as I go along. But at the end of 6 months, I had something that was pretty long, but it had the semblance of a narrative. And I was keeping a lot of notes of where I would have to footnote or index certain areas. The footnotes were important to keep track of because I had a lot of facts in there. But I do write in such a way that I don't want the footnotes to upend my momentum when I'm writing. So that does get tricky. And many times when I worked on the footnotes for this book, I really had to rediscover where I sourced some things from because I wasn't really keeping diligent track of that because I didn't want it to get in the way of the writing process, which is so fun. It just feels like you're in a wind tunnel sometimes and like your hair is flying back or on like a motorcycle because you don't want anything upending that. And you can get really mired down if you're notating things as you go along, especially if you scrap them later, then what would you just notate that for? Totally. So it's an inexact science. I'm still trying to figure that part out.
So what you wound up with at the end of your 6-month sprint, how much more rewriting did you have to do to get it into its final form?
Another 6 months of rewriting. And then there was about 4 months of just writing the footnotes, the index, the bibliography. Those I think take up maybe a fifth of the book, of its total pages. So all told, I mean, I started it right after Freewaytopia came out. So that would have been like December of 21. And then I had most of the book written by December of 23. So it was like 2 years overall, that whole process. And then we did very minor adjustments, my publisher and I, for a few months after that. I mean, it was pretty much ready to go. And we actually did send out early galleys to, try to get advanced quotes from critics and to publicize it. I did an audiobook that was the spring of 2024. And then the book came out in June, but it was done and sent to the printer by March of 2024.
Wait, I've been listening to the audiobook. Is that your voice?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I always thanks. The feedback from a lot of audiobook publishers and just anecdotally is, and myself included, is I like when authors read their own books.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah, because it might be imprecise, but that's part of the appeal to me is you don't want a really polished actor, unless it's like a really good fiction book. Then I can understand why you want a great actor or voice actor reading it. But for something that's nonfiction, I think the author is going to bring a passion and a knowledge to the material that's going to transcend the audio and transcend the page. And just, it's going to strike you as really more authentic. And they're going to be pronouncing names correctly.
Yes.
I can't tell you how many times I've listened to audiobooks that are nonfiction audiobooks read by not the author, by someone else who has no connection to Los Angeles, if it's a book about LA. I listened to one book where the voice actor referred to Eli Broad as Eli Broad. Like 5 or 6 times in the book. And Eli Broad is a very famous billionaire philanthropist. Now, his last name looks like it should be pronounced Broad, but it's Broad.
It does.
So that's just one example of, an audiobook I listened to where they didn't have a familiarity with the local, the people in the book who are Angelenos and important figures. I listened to another one that was a best-selling, oh my God, I don't even want to say what the book is. I don't want to shame them. But it was about another one about Los Angeles, and the author, every time he came across Warner Brothers, which in print is always written as Warner, BROS, period. Warner Brothers. We all saw it on Looney Tunes cartoons and old movies, Casablanca, you name it. It's Warner Brothers. Every time he came across Warner Brothers when he was reading this author's book, he said Warner Bros.
That's so good.
I kid you not. I misheard it first. Like, wait, what? I went back and he's like, so when Warner Bros. Came in and decided that they needed to open a studio, Warner Bros. And it was released by Warner Bros. But the distributor was actually RKO. Oh my God. I was like, did one of these. You can't have that. And when you think of all the filters that has to go through, this was one of the big 5 publishers. So they had, their credit to the end were a lot longer than mine. My audiobook was me. I recorded it. I had to engineer it. I narrated, whatever, I edited it. But this had editors, audio producers, had nice music in the beginning and in the end. There were probably 10 or 12 people involved with it. And that even surprises me that Warner Bros. Is able to fly with even, I'm sure, the author having listened to it. I hope he did, he or she. But maybe they didn't because that was allowed to be published like that. Yeah. Anyway, sorry to go off on that tangent, but that's one reason I think it's good for an author to read their own book.
I totally agree with you. And I have to say, normally I would look to check, but I didn't even look to check because I just thought it was so well done that they must have hired someone. So you did such a good job that you just sounded like a professional voice actor.
Who hopefully pronounced all the names correctly.
Yes, all the names were definitely pronounced correctly. That's so funny. So tell us about the publishing journey to find Santa Monica Press. Was it at home there from the beginning, or how did that work?
It was, for this book, Inventing Paradise, it seemed like a natural connection to do it with Santa Monica Press because that publisher had published my other books that were about Los Angeles. So I naturally pitched them first, and they liked the idea. So it was nice to not have to shop around an idea for months. Right. And we have a good system in place where We complement each other. They kind of know my style. I know theirs. We have a shorthand, and I had been working with them since 2012. So this is my fifth book with them,
Oh, wow.
including a reprint of a book where I added some additional stuff. So really 4 books, maybe 5. Yeah. So because it's a local publisher, Santa Monica Press, I knew that they'd be interested in my nonfiction work, which is locally based. I like to write about Los Angeles. So it seemed like a natural fit.
So, your last book led you to this book. Did you find something while writing this that's next, or is it a total diversion?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out now, because I'm torn between focusing on some individuals, again, maybe people lesser known as the 6 I write about in Inventing Paradise, or doing something more along the lines as Freewaytopia, which focused a lot on transit and transportation in LA, incorporating, again, a lot of important figures. But I'm trying to figure out which direction to go in. Do I want to focus on like infrastructure, or more on the people who help create the infrastructure but lean more into their lives? So that's where I'm at right now. I'm kind of at a crossroads, and still trying to figure out what the next project would be.
So you just do more research until you're like, okay, it's this.
Yeah, I'm doing research right now on what's in the marketplace, because
Uh-huh.
I feel that's important to fill a void in the marketplace. What has not really been written about very much? Freewaytopia certainly fit that bill. There had been no large scale book about freeways ever written about LA. And anything I found was more academic, really written
Uh-huh.
by professors, really more for like that world. And even the most recent one, yeah, there have been books on Mulholland and Henry Huntington, but I didn't feel there was a book that intercut between these titans as like my book did. And certainly incorporating Moses Sherman, I thought, was the secret sauce of this one. Moses
Uh-huh.
Sherman has not been well covered, but he's a really influential figure on LA history that has really been underwritten up to this point. So that factored into my most recent one. I felt that there was a story that needed to be told there. So I'm looking for those stories that need to be told.
I didn't realize West Hollywood was called Sherman before. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. When they changed the name from Sherman to West Hollywood to capitalize off the popularity of Hollywood, it was maybe going to be called East Beverly Hills when they were
Oh,
thinking of capitalizing off Beverly Hills notoriety. This was in the mid 20s when both Hollywood and Beverly Hills were very big. It was the height of industry stardom in both cities and a lot of celebrities living there. So Sherman became West Hollywood, and Sherman himself was so upset by that he had a parcel of land in the valley. He immediately named that Sherman Oaks. And so Sherman Oaks has survived to this day.
yeah.
But yeah, Sherman also, he actually had not just Sherman Way, which still exists in the valley. It's a very long, broad street, but there
Uh-huh.
was another Sherman Way that was north-south. So Sherman Way is still to this day a west-east artery through the whole San Fernando Valley. And Van Nuys Boulevard, as it exists today, is a very famous north-south boulevard in the valley. That was another Sherman Way, but it was the
Oh,
north-south Sherman Way. So he had 2 streets named after himself that were the most important streets in the valley, going
he's
each
like, I gotta
direction.
make up for this West Hollywood thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, do you have any? I mean, you've done what I see as a lot of bucket list writing goals already, but do you have any future bucket list writing goals?
I would love to, because I worked in television and still do, but that was really my primary job for 20, 25 years, is working in TV, mostly in unscripted. I would love to work on the scripted side of TV. I
Oh, yeah.
have created scripts on spec, like a lot of people in this town, and I entered them in festivals at one point. One of them it won the grand prize for comedy. This one that I was really proud of, and I got a manager out of it, and I thought maybe it would get picked up or developed by a
Uh-huh.
company. Nothing ever happened there. I've written some novels that I feel would be good, either TV series or TV show, or even
Uh-huh.
a film. That would be my bucket list. It's probably doubtful that's ever going to happen, because again, everybody they want to write the great American screenplay. But I feel like my existing material, these novels I've written, would make good, certainly TV series. I didn't write them with that in mind, but there's something I would want to see. And there have been people who expressed the same thoughts to me, but they were really not in a position to do anything about it. Or if they tried, it really didn't go anywhere. So that would be like chasing the probably impossible dream. I think it's good to have
Don't
those
say
things you always
that.
aspire to. Oh, that's what makes it the hunt,
The
the chase
bucket
is part of the
list,
fun.
yes.
Yeah, that's why
Yeah.
it's a bucket list, right? So it's important to have that.
I think Inventing Paradise, a soapy version, would be like a super fun TV show, wouldn't it?
It would absolutely. There's a lot of really the great thing about researching a book like Inventing Paradise is coming across these letters between all these guys. It's like reading diaries from middle school. It's
Yeah.
very, and I put, some of the excerpts are in the book. It's very juicy, a lot of backstabbing. They're like the Kardashians, just like these old
Yeah.
men, though. But yeah, I do feel that certain sections of their personal lives would make for an interesting TV series. And I will confess that an agent, when they saw the book was on the bestseller list, I think they just reached out to anyone who was on that list. They contacted me and said, "Are the TV and film rights available?" I said, "Yeah, they are." I haven't heard back. I'm just going to say that. So people have inquired, but again, it's a tough sell because it's also the 1890s to like 1930s. Do people care about that era? I mean, yeah, like there's like
I
True
do.
Detective, and there's a lot of really good, retro shows.
Perry Mason.
Perry Mason, exactly. So I think there's a good story out there to be told. It's just you have to get someone who's really passionate about bankrolling it and who sees a way to deliver it to a contemporary audience. Also, an audience that's going to care that if you don't live in LA, why should you care? And you mentioned Perry Mason, and there are a lot of LA movies, stories, TV shows that are based in LA and that are period pieces. So I'm hopeful that someone will find the right way into it and be, interested enough that they would want to adapt it.
Yes, we're manifesting that. Okay, I've got
Yes.
just a couple lightning questions to close. So, what piece of writing advice do you wish you could give your former self?
Well, I was really hell bent on trying to break in the industry with like a really flashy screenplay when I was in my 20s and I graduated from film school. But when I look back at those screenplays now, they're just vacuous. They're told from a place that is false or fake. It has nothing of myself in them.
Right.
I was trying to manufacture like a really good action script or a thriller. But ultimately, to me, they were just lacking in originality. And so what I needed to learn was just to have life experiences and to really find my voice. And that really didn't happen until my 40s, really, at least as a nonfiction writer. And I would say writing my novels too, which were all done in the last 10 years or so. I had to reach a point in my life where I had something to say and where I had enough life experience to know how the world works and where things sound like they resonate from a real place as opposed to a manufactured place, like in my 20s when I just was treating them like commodities that were just going to wow people into like throwing money my way. I would just tell myself, get more life experience because that helps your writing.
Yeah. I think that's the beauty of writing, though. It's like the one job where like you keep getting better the older that you are because of that, really.
I agree with you. And I feel Inventing Paradise is my best written book because of things I've learned from the past. And I feel like I'm only going to get better. That's one nice thing about growing older.
Yeah. What's one tip for writers trying to get a book published?
Well, I have two. One is be passionate about whatever you're writing about. Write from that real place. Lean into your nerdum. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
If you're really passionate about something in a way that other people aren't, you've already got a step up on them because you'll be surprised how many people gravitate to your passion and maybe you're unlocking something within them that they didn't know they need to care about. And then also don't be slave to trying to get an agent. I've never had a literary agent. And I was lucky enough to go directly to Santa Monica Press as my publisher, who I've developed a good relationship with, and they publish my books. But I've reached out to other publishers directly in the past, and we've talked about doing projects, and they were happy to read my material. So especially in the nonfiction world, it's fiction, a little harder to really make a book that's going to get a lot of buzz if you don't go to one of the big 5 publishers, and to approach them, you do need an agent. But there's plenty of good boutique publishers, and in the nonfiction world, there's many good, bigger publishers who will look at your material without a literary agent. So, scour those books similar to the ones you want to write, look on Amazon, see who publishes them, and you can go to their websites and figure out who do you reach out to, and usually they'll look at your work.
That's a great tip. And then what's your all-time favorite piece of your own writing? Is it Inventing Paradise?
Yeah, I would say, your books are like your children. There's never the one favorite. I think in terms of like scope and the ability to take a complex world like Inventing Paradise and intercutting between all these protagonists, I'm very proud with that I was able to kind of keep some sense of story that doesn't confuse people. It was my biggest lift, I guess. So I was happy about that I kind of met the challenge there. But I do like the breeziness of Freewaytopia and some other nonfiction books I've done that are really infused with a lot of my sensibilities, even more so than Inventing Paradise, and that there's a playfulness behind them. So I think the best way to learn is having not cheeky, but a playful tone that is conversational and accessible, like a good teacher. Think of your favorite teachers. They're the ones who made learning fun. And I'm a big proponent of that. And I feel like I don't want to work on any book unless I'm having fun writing it. And hopefully that translates to the page as well. So I like them all for different reasons.
I love that. And how can listeners connect with you online? Are you on the internet?
I am. I'm on social media, in particular Twitter/X, and really on Instagram as well. Not as much because I'm more like word driven, which lends itself more to Twitter. But for both of those social media platforms, they can find me at LA_dorkout.
Yes.
Like I'm known as LA Dork on Twitter, but I had to choose the handle LA_dorkout because LA Dork was taken. But yeah, that's the header on my banner is LA Dork. That's another way to just find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It was so fun to chat about this book. I loved it.
I had a great time, Courtney. Great questions, and I really appreciate everything that you said about it and your support. I hope your listeners feel as positively about the book as you do.
Thanks again to Paul for the history lesson and all of your insights on writing and research and publishing. I learned so much from your interview, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of The Bleeders. Oh, writing is so much better with friends. I'm your host, Courtney Kosak, and hey, let's connect on social media. I am at Courtney Kosak, last name is Kosak on Twitter and Instagram. And make sure you're signed up for the Bleeders Companion Substack for all kinds of newsletter exclusives. It is free to subscribe, and I just launched a paid subscription where I am taking you behind the scenes of all my best bylines, and I published a post about my return to stand-up comedy and how I got ready to crush my showcase. I also wrote about my MFA and whether or not I think it is worth it, and I did an amazing manifestation workshop to ring in the new year. It is one of my favorite workshops I have ever taught. So there is a link to sign up for the Bleeders Companion Substack in the episode description. I encourage you to do so, and join me again next week for another incredible episode. In the meantime, happy bleeding!